On May 11, 1979, a woman who had once possessed more wealth than most people could imagine died quietly inside a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. There were no crowds gathered outside, no great public mourning, no endless procession of powerful friends coming to say goodbye. When the funeral was held, fewer than a dozen people attended. It was a remarkably lonely ending for someone who had spent nearly her entire life surrounded by attention, because this was not an ordinary woman. Her name was Barbara Hutton. At one point, she was one of the richest women in the world. She inherited a fortune so vast that newspapers compared her wealth to royalty. She owned magnificent homes in New York, London, and Tangier. She wore jewels that had once belonged to European dynasties. She travelled with princes, entertained aristocrats, and moved through a world that most people only glimpsed in magazines. And yet, for all her wealth, Barbara Hutton spent much of her life searching for something she never seemed able to find. Love. Not admiration, not status, not luxury. Love. Over the years, she married 7 times, 7 different men, princes, aristocrats, and even one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, Cary Grant. Each marriage began with hope. Each marriage seemed to offer the possibility of a different ending. And yet every one of them eventually collapsed. By the time Barbara reached her final years, the palaces were quieter, the parties had ended. Many of the people who once surrounded her had disappeared. The wealth remained, the loneliness remained too. And that raises a question that has fascinated historians, biographers, and ordinary people for decades. How could a woman who had everything money could buy spend her entire life feeling so alone? The easy answer is to blame the wrong husbands, or bad decisions, or the curse of extreme wealth. But the truth may be far more complicated. Because Barbara Hutton's story did not begin with diamonds. It did not begin with inheritance, and it certainly did not begin with 7 marriages. It began with a little girl who lost something long before she ever inherited billions of dollars. A little girl who learned, far too early, that the people she loved could disappear, and perhaps that is the key to understanding everything that came afterward. The fortune, the heartbreak, the endless search for love, and the loneliness that followed her all the way to the end. This is not simply the story of one of the richest women who ever lived. It is the story of a question that Barbara Hutton spent her entire life trying to answer. Why, despite having everything, did she never truly feel loved? Long before Barbara Hutton became one of the richest women in the world, she was simply a little girl who wanted what every child wants. To feel protected. To know that someone would always be there. The tragedy of Barbara Hutton's life did not begin with money, it began with loss. Barbara was born in New York City in 1912 into one of America's wealthiest families. The Woolworth fortune was already transforming the family into a symbol of success and privilege. From the outside, her future seemed almost magical. But inside the Hutton household, things were far less beautiful. Her parents' marriage was deeply troubled. Her father, Franklin Hutton, was charming, handsome, and popular in New York society. He was also known for his affairs and his inability to remain faithful. Barbara's mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, lived under the constant humiliation of public gossip and private disappointment. As the years passed, the marriage became increasingly unhappy. Even though Barbara was too young to understand the details, children often sense tension long before they understand it. They notice the silence at the dinner table. They notice the arguments that stop when they enter the room. They notice the sadness in a parent's eyes. And Barbara noticed. Then came the event that would quietly shape the rest of her life. In 1917, when Barbara was only 4 years old, her mother died. Official reports described illness as the cause, but rumours circulated for decades. Some claimed Edna had taken poison after another devastating betrayal by her husband. Others insisted those rumours were exaggerated. The truth may never be known with certainty. What matters is that a 4-year-old girl lost her mother, and for a child, that loss changes everything. Adults often think children recover quickly because they continue playing, laughing, and going about their daily lives. But childhood grief does not disappear. It simply grows in silence. Many psychologists believe that a child's earliest relationships create a blueprint for how they will understand love later in life. Who can be trusted? Who will stay? Who might leave? Barbara's blueprint was shattered before she was old enough to understand what had happened. In the years that followed, she was surrounded by wealth but deprived of stability. Servants cared for her, governesses supervised her, relatives made decisions about her future. Yet none of those people could replace the one person she had lost. The older Barbara became, the more difficult it was to ignore another painful reality. Her father seemed emotionally distant. Franklin Hutton was not a cruel man, but he was not the kind of father who provided emotional security. His own life revolved around society, business, and personal pursuits. Barbara often seemed to exist on the edge of his world rather than at the centre of it. A child does not need perfection. A child needs presence. And presence was exactly what Barbara lacked. There was one exception. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth. Unlike many adults around her, he genuinely adored her. He called her princess. He showered her with affection and attention. For a brief period, he became the closest thing Barbara had to a secure emotional anchor. Perhaps for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. Then, in 1919, that anchor disappeared too. Frank Woolworth died when Barbara was only 6 years old. Another person gone. Another goodbye. Another loss she could not control. Looking back, it is difficult not to see a pattern beginning to form. The people Barbara loved most kept leaving. First her mother, then her grandfather, and with every loss a quiet fear grew stronger. A fear that would follow her into adulthood. A fear that would shape her marriages, her friendships, and many of the choices she later made. Because somewhere deep inside, long before the headlines, long before the fortune, long before the 7 husbands, a little girl had learned a heartbreaking lesson. Love was not permanent. The people you needed most could disappear. And once that belief takes root in a child, it can be incredibly difficult to unlearn. Barbara Hutton would spend the rest of her life searching for something she lost before she even entered kindergarten. The certainty that someone she loved would stay. If losing her mother taught Barbara Hutton that love could disappear, the years that followed taught her something else. Money could not bring it back. As Barbara grew older, the Woolworth fortune continued to expand around her like a magnificent stage set. There were sprawling estates, private servants, luxury beyond imagination, and one day there would be an inheritance so large that newspapers would struggle to describe it. To most people, this sounds like a dream. For Barbara, it often felt more like a strange substitute for something she could not name. After the deaths of her mother and grandfather, she spent much of her childhood moving through a world that seemed designed to impress everyone except the person living inside it. The houses were enormous, the rooms were beautiful, but beauty and comfort are not always the same thing. Many years later, people who visited the family's estates often described them as breathtaking. Marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, endless hallways, formal dining rooms large enough to host dozens of guests. Yet for a child, those same spaces could feel overwhelmingly empty. Imagine being surrounded by everything money could buy, while feeling uncertain about who truly belonged to you. That was Barbara's reality. Servants helped raise her. Governesses supervised her education. Family members managed her future. But very few people provided the kind of emotional connection children naturally need. The irony was almost cruel. The richer Barbara became, the more difficult it was to trust the motives of the people around her. Most children grow up assuming that affection comes naturally. Barbara grew up wondering if affection had conditions attached to it. Was someone being kind because they genuinely cared? Or because she was a Woolworth? Was someone interested in her thoughts, or interested in the fortune she would one day control? These are not questions most children ask. But Barbara was not living a normal childhood. By the time she entered her teenage years, newspapers were already paying attention to her. Society columns discussed her future. Adults spoke about her inheritance as though it were a public event waiting to happen. People saw a fortune. They rarely saw the girl, and slowly, Barbara began to see herself through the same lens. That may have been one of the most damaging consequences of extreme wealth. When everyone around you constantly reminds you how valuable your fortune is, it becomes difficult to separate your own worth from the money attached to your name. Barbara inherited wealth before she had the opportunity to build an identity. Before she could discover who she wanted to become, the world had already decided who she was. The Woolworth heiress, the richest girl in America. the future owner of one of the largest fortunes in the country. Labels replaced individuality. Expectations replaced self-discovery. And beneath those expectations lived a young woman who was still trying to understand where she belonged. The more people talked about her money, the less certain she became about herself. Perhaps that is why Barbara spent so much of her life searching for validation from other people. Deep down, she wanted proof that there was something lovable about her beyond the inheritance. Something valuable that had nothing to do with Woolworth stores, bank accounts, or family estates. But that proof never seemed easy to find, because wealth has a strange way of attracting people while simultaneously making trust more difficult. The richer Barbara became, the more attention she received. But attention is not the same thing as affection, and admiration is not the same thing as love. These distinctions would become increasingly important as she entered adulthood. For now, however, Barbara remained trapped in an uncomfortable contradiction. She possessed more financial security than almost anyone in America. Yet emotionally, she often felt insecure. She was surrounded by people, yet she frequently felt alone. She belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the country. Yet she struggled to understand her own place in the world. Years later, many observers would look at Barbara Hutton's life and ask why she kept searching for happiness in relationships that repeatedly disappointed her. The answer may have begun here. In the years when money filled every corner of her world while emotional certainty remained frustratingly out of reach, because a child can survive without luxury, a child can survive without privilege. But a child who grows up questioning whether she's loved for who she is or for what she owns carries that uncertainty into adulthood. And by the time Barbara Hutton became a young woman, that uncertainty had already become part of her. The fortune had made her powerful, but it had not made her feel secure, and that difference would shape nearly every important decision she made for the rest of her life. By the time Barbara Hutton entered adulthood, she had become exactly what society expected her to be. Beautiful, elegant, famous, and unimaginably wealthy. On paper, she seemed to possess every advantage imaginable. Yet beneath the glamour, something was still missing, the same thing that had been missing since childhood. A feeling of emotional safety. Looking back, one of the most common questions people ask about Barbara Hutton is simple. Why did she keep marrying the wrong men? Why did so many of her relationships end in disappointment? Why did she repeatedly place her trust in people who seemed unable or unwilling to love her in return? The answer may have less to do with the men themselves than with what Barbara was searching for. Because Barbara was not merely looking for a husband. She was looking for certainty. She was looking for reassurance. She was looking for someone who would stay, and people who desperately want to feel secure sometimes become vulnerable to those who appear capable of providing it. Barbara was barely 20 years old when she married Prince Alexis Mdivani in 1933. To the public, the match seemed almost perfect. She was one of the richest young women in the world. He was a European prince. It sounded like a fairy tale. But fairy tales often look very different once the wedding is over. Alexis came from a family famous for marrying wealthy women. Titles carried enormous social prestige during that era, particularly among newly rich American families seeking acceptance from old European aristocracy. For Barbara, however, the attraction went deeper than status. Alexis represented something she had always wanted: protection, importance, belonging. The title carried emotional weight. It suggested permanence, stability, security, at least in theory, but reality arrived quickly. According to several accounts, Alexis criticised Barbara's appearance almost immediately after their marriage. Whether every detail reported over the years is accurate or not, there is little doubt that Barbara became increasingly obsessed with her weight and appearance during this period. For a young woman whose sense of self was already fragile, criticism from someone she loved cut deeply. And perhaps that should not surprise us. People who feel secure inside themselves can often survive rejection. People who have spent years questioning their worth usually experience rejection very differently. They experience it as confirmation. Confirmation that they are not enough. Confirmation that they may be abandoned once again. The marriage eventually collapsed. But something more important remained: a pattern. Barbara had entered the relationship, believing she had finally found someone who would make her feel safe. When the relationship failed, the old wound reopened, and instead of healing, she looked for another relationship to close it. Then another, and another. Over time, this pattern became one of the defining features of her life. Many people mistakenly assume Barbara married repeatedly because she loved romance. The truth may be far more complicated. Hope can be addictive, especially for someone who has spent years feeling emotionally incomplete. Every new relationship offered the possibility of a different ending. Maybe this man would understand her. Maybe this man would stay. Maybe this man would love Barbara rather than the Woolworth fortune. For a while, each new romance seemed to answer those hopes. Then reality would intervene, the illusion would collapse, and the search would begin again. This is one reason why Barbara's story feels so tragic. The men she married were not identical. Some were charming, some were selfish, some were ambitious, some were genuinely kind. Yet the outcome was often similar because the deeper problem existed long before any of them appeared. Barbara was asking her relationships to solve a pain that had begun in childhood. That is an impossible burden for any marriage. No husband could undo the loss of her mother. No prince could erase the loneliness of those empty hallways. No title could provide the emotional foundation that should have been built decades earlier. And yet Barbara continued searching. Not because she was foolish, not because she was weak, but because hope is one of the most powerful forces in human life, especially when it is connected to a wound that never fully heals. The world saw a wealthy heiress marrying princes and aristocrats. What it did not see was a little girl still searching for proof that she was worthy of being loved and never abandoned. And that search was far from over. In fact, it was only becoming more complicated. Because as Barbara's fame grew, another problem emerged. People were no longer simply interested in her. They were fascinated by her, and sometimes the attention she received began to feel very similar to love. Barbara Hutton moved through her 20s and 30s, something unusual began to happen. She was no longer simply one of the richest women in America. She was becoming a public fascination. Newspapers followed her everywhere. Society columnists analysed her relationships. Photographers documented her travels, her homes, her clothes, and her marriages. The public watched her life unfold almost like a serial drama. And for a woman who had spent much of her childhood feeling unseen, that attention could feel intoxicating. But attention and love are not the same thing. Unfortunately, they can sometimes feel very similar. It's especially to someone who has spent years longing to feel valued. When people speak about Barbara Hutton today, they often focus on the money, the diamonds, the estates, the headlines. What is discussed less often is how lonely fame can become. Because fame creates a strange illusion. Thousands of people know your name, yet very few people truly know you. Barbara increasingly lived inside that illusion. Wherever she went, people noticed her, men admired her, journalists wrote about her, society hostesses wanted her at their parties, designers wanted to dress her, photographers wanted her image. The world seemed fascinated by Barbara Hutton. But fascination is not intimacy, admiration is not understanding, and public attention is not emotional connection. Yet when someone has spent years searching for reassurance, those distinctions can become difficult to recognise. Imagine spending your entire childhood wondering if you matter, then suddenly finding yourself surrounded by people eager to speak with you, photograph you, praise you, and invite you into their world. For a while, it must have felt wonderful, perhaps even healing, at least on the surface, because every invitation felt like acceptance, every compliment felt like validation, every romantic pursuit felt like proof that she was wanted. And being wanted can sometimes feel very much like being loved, at first. But there is a problem with building self-worth on attention. Attention is temporary. Today's fascination becomes tomorrow's forgotten headline. Today's admirer becomes tomorrow's stranger. And Barbara would experience that reality again and again. Each new romance followed a familiar pattern. A man would enter her life. He would make her feel special. He would make her feel chosen. For a brief period, the loneliness seemed to disappear. Then something would change. The excitement would fade. The relationship would become more complicated. Disappointments would emerge. Trust would weaken. And eventually, the connection would unravel. When that happened, Barbara often found herself returning to the same emotional place she had known since childhood. Alone, looking for answers, looking for reassurance, looking for someone who would stay. The tragedy is that every failed relationship seemed to reinforce the fears she already carried. Each ending felt less like a single disappointment and more like evidence. Evidence that people eventually leave. Evidence that affection does not last. Evidence that she might never be enough. Whether those fears were rational or not almost doesn't matter. Because emotional wounds are rarely governed by logic. They are governed by memory. And Barbara's deepest memories were filled with loss. This is one reason her story continues to resonate with people today. Because most of us have experienced some version of this pattern. Perhaps not with millions of dollars involved. Perhaps not in the public eye. But many people know what it feels like to confuse attention with love. To believe that being pursued means being understood. To mistake admiration for acceptance. Barbara simply lived out that struggle on a much larger stage. In many ways, her wealth made the problem worse. The richer she became, the harder it became to separate genuine affection from self-interest. The more famous she became, the harder it became to know who truly cared. And the more lonely she felt, the more tempting new relationships became. Each one offered another chance, another beginning, another opportunity to finally receive what had been missing for so long. But by now, a painful pattern had firmly established itself. Barbara would feel lonely. Someone new would arrive. Hope would return. The relationship would disappoint. The loneliness would come back. Then the cycle would begin again. The world saw a glamorous heiress living a romantic life filled with princes, aristocrats, and celebrities. What Barbara experienced was something very different. A series of attempts to fill an emotional emptiness that no amount of attention seemed able to satisfy. And nowhere would that pattern become more visible than in her marriages. Because by the time Barbara reached middle age, she had already learned a painful lesson. Being wanted and being loved were not the same thing. Yet she continued searching for a relationship that might finally prove otherwise. By the time Barbara Hutton reached middle age, fact had become impossible to ignore. She had married 7 times. To many observers, the number itself seemed to explain everything. People assumed she was impulsive, or reckless, or endlessly dissatisfied. Newspapers often portrayed her as a woman constantly searching for the next romance. But what if they were asking the wrong question? Perhaps the real mystery was not why Barbara married 7 times. Perhaps the real mystery was why none of those marriages could give her what she was looking for. Because when we examine Barbara's life closely, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a pattern of romance, a pattern of hope. Again and again, Barbara found herself standing at the beginning of what appeared to be a new chapter. A new man entered her life. A new future seemed possible. Old disappointments faded into the background. For a while, optimism returned. This time would be different. This time she would be understood. This time she would finally feel secure. And for a brief period, she often did. That is what makes the cycle so heartbreaking. The hope was genuine. The belief was genuine. Barbara truly wanted these relationships to succeed. She was not collecting husbands. She was searching for something. Something she had been searching for since childhood. The feeling of being chosen and never abandoned. The problem was that every new relationship arrived carrying expectations that no human being could, realistically, fulfill. Without realizing it, Barbara often asked her marriages to heal wounds that had existed long before the wedding day. She wanted certainty. She wanted permanence. She wanted reassurance. She wanted someone who could silence the fear she had carried since she was a little girl. But no spouse can completely erase a lifetime of insecurity. And when reality inevitably failed to match hope, disappointment followed. Then the loneliness returned. And loneliness can be persuasive, especially when it has been following someone for decades. One of the most revealing relationships in Barbara's life was her marriage to Cary Grant. Unlike some of her other husbands, Cary Grant was not viewed as a fortune hunter. Even years later, many people who knew both of them believed he genuinely cared about her. For a moment, it appeared that Barbara had finally found someone different, someone who saw beyond the money, someone who understood her vulnerabilities, someone who might stay. Yet even that marriage eventually ended, not with scandal, not with public warfare, but with the recognition that affection alone could not solve deeper emotional struggles. And perhaps that tells us something important. The problem was never simply finding the right man. The problem was the burden Barbara placed upon the relationship itself. When a person believes happiness depends entirely upon another individual, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. No husband could become the mother she lost. No husband could recreate the security she never fully experienced. No husband could travel back in time and repair the fears formed in childhood. Yet Barbara kept hoping, because hope often survives long after evidence suggests it should. In fact, hope may have been one of the strongest forces in her entire life. That is why I don't believe Barbara Hutton was addicted to marriage. I think she was addicted to possibility, to the feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, the next chapter would finally be the one that brought peace. Many people can relate to that impulse, not because they married 7 times, but because they have experienced the temptation of believing that one major change will solve every problem. A new relationship, a new job, a new city, a new beginning. Sometimes those changes help, sometimes they do not. Barbara repeatedly placed her faith in new beginnings because she desperately wanted a different ending. Unfortunately, every ending seemed to resemble the one before it. The excitement faded, reality arrived, disappointment followed. And once again she found herself confronting the same question she had been asking for years. Why did happiness never seem to last? The answers may be painful. Because the thing Barbara was searching for was never actually hidden inside any marriage. It was hidden inside a wound that had never fully healed. The little girl who lost her mother. The little girl who lost her grandfather. The little girl who grew up surrounded by wealth but uncertain of her worth. She was still there. And she was still waiting for someone to make her feel safe. By the time Barbara approached her later years, she had accumulated husbands, titles, mansions, jewellery and memories. Yet the feeling she wanted most remained frustratingly out of reach. And then life delivered a loss far greater than any failed marriage. A loss that would break something inside her that never truly recovered. Because there was one person in Barbara Hutton's life whose love had always felt different. One person whose presence was not connected to wealth, status or expectation. His name was Lance Reventlow. For most of her life, Barbara Hutton struggled to answer a question that haunted nearly every relationship she had. Do they love me, or do they love what I have? It was a question she asked about husbands, friends, social acquaintances, even members of her own world. But there was one person she never had to ask it about. Her son Lance Reventlow. If Barbara spent much of her life searching for unconditional love, Lance may have been the closest she ever came to finding it. Unlike the men who entered her life, Lance wanted nothing from her. He was not interested in her fortune. He was not attracted to her social status. He was not trying to gain access to her world. He simply loved her because she was his mother, and perhaps that is why their relationship mattered so much. From the moment Lance was born in 1936, Barbara's life changed. For the first time she was not someone's daughter, not someone's wife, not the Woolworth heiress, not a public figure. She was a mother, and motherhood gave her something she had been seeking for years. A sense of purpose, a sense of connection, a sense that she truly mattered to another human being. Many people who knew Barbara later observed that Lance occupied a unique place in her heart. He represented something genuine in a life that often felt uncertain. When relationships failed, Lance remained. When marriages ended, Lance remained. When society became cruel, Lance remained. He was one of the few constants in a life defined by change. And perhaps there was yet another reason she loved him so fiercely. Lance's presence allowed Barbara to experience something she had rarely felt herself. The opportunity to give the kind of love she had always wanted to receive. In some ways, she was not only raising a son, she was trying to heal a part of herself. As Lance grew older, he developed his own interests and ambitions. Unlike many heirs born into great wealth, he wanted to create something of his own. He became fascinated with automobiles and racing, eventually founding the Scarab Sports Car Company. Barbara watched with pride. For once, someone she loved was building an identity that had nothing to do with inheritance. Lance wanted to achieve something on his own terms, and perhaps Barbara admired that because she herself had never truly been given the chance. The years passed. Lance became a successful racing driver. He married. He built his own life. And although no parent enjoys watching a child grow independent, there was comfort in knowing he was still there, still alive, still connected to her, still part of her world. Then, in 1972, everything changed. Lance Reventlow died in a plane crash in Colorado. He was only 36 years old. For Barbara, the loss was devastating. To outsiders, it may have appeared similar to the tragedies she had already endured. Another death, another goodbye, another heartbreak. But this one was different, because Lance was different. His death did not simply remove someone she loved. It removed the safest emotional relationship she had ever known. Throughout her life, Barbara had often questioned the motives of others. She doubted husbands, she doubted friends, she doubted the intentions of people drawn to wealth and status. With Lance, those doubts disappeared. The relationship was uncomplicated, authentic, real, and now it was gone. People sometimes speak of grief as though it were a single event. In reality, grief often reopens every previous loss. When Lance died, Barbara was not only mourning her son, in many ways, she was mourning her mother again, her grandfather again, every abandonment, every disappointment, every relationship that had ended before she was ready. All of it seemed to come rushing back. Friends noticed the change. The woman who had already spent decades battling loneliness appeared increasingly withdrawn. The spark that had survived so many disappointments began to fade. The truth is that Barbara Hutton had spent much of her life searching for emotional security. She searched for it in marriage. She searched for it in romance. She searched for it in status and attention. But the place she found it most naturally was in her relationship with Lance. And when he died, the loss was almost impossible to recover from. Because some losses take away more than a person. They take away hope. For years, Barbara had continued believing that happiness might still be possible, that peace might still be waiting somewhere ahead, that life could still surprise her. After Lance's death, that belief became harder to maintain. The world continued to see an heiress, a celebrity, a wealthy social figure. But behind those headlines was an aging woman carrying a grief that few people fully understood. A woman who had finally found the unconditional love she had spent decades searching for, only to lose it once again. And perhaps that is the cruelest irony of Barbara Hutton's story. The thing she wanted most was never money, never status, never another husband. It was the certainty that someone she loved would remain, and once again, life had taken that certainty away. As the years passed, Barbara found herself confronting a painful realization. Having everything did not protect a person from heartbreak. In some ways, it made the heartbreak even more difficult to understand, which raises an even larger question. If wealth could not protect Barbara Hutton from loneliness, loss, or despair, what exactly can money protect us from? After Barbara Hutton's death, countless articles attempted to explain her life. Some blamed her husbands. Others blamed the fortune. Some focused on the scandals. Others focused on the loneliness. But perhaps Barbara's story raises a much larger question. What happens when a person receives everything they need to survive, yet never receives what they need to feel secure? For generations, people have been fascinated by the wealthy. We imagine that money solves problems. And to be fair, it does solve many problems. Money can provide comfort, it can provide safety, it can provide freedom, it can remove countless daily worries that burden ordinary people. But Barbara Hutton's life reminds us of something uncomfortable. Money can solve practical problems. It cannot solve emotional ones. In fact, extreme wealth sometimes creates problems of its own. Most people grow up gradually building an identity. They discover what they enjoy, what they believe, what they value. They make mistakes. They learn, they grow, and eventually they become someone. Barbara's experience was very different. Before she had the chance to become someone, the world had already decided who she was. The Woolworth heiress, the richest girl in America, a fortune, an inheritance, a symbol. Imagine spending your entire life walking into rooms where people already think they know you, not because of your character, not because of your accomplishments, but because of your bank account. Eventually, a person begins asking a dangerous question. If the money disappeared, who would I be? Barbara spent much of her life surrounded by people. Yet she rarely seemed convinced that those relationships were entirely genuine, and perhaps that fear was not irrational. Extreme wealth creates uncertainty. Not because everyone has bad intentions, but because it becomes difficult to distinguish between affection and self-interest. The richer a person becomes, the harder trust can become. That is one reason so many wealthy families struggle across generations. Contrary to popular belief, inheritance does not automatically create happiness. Sometimes it creates confusion, especially when children inherit money before they inherit a strong sense of self. Across history, Barbara Hutton was hardly alone. There have been countless heirs who inherited extraordinary fortunes yet struggled to find meaning. Some battled addiction, some battled depression. Some became isolated, others spent years searching for purpose. Their stories are different, but the question often remains the same. How do you build a meaningful life when every material need has already been satisfied? Most people are motivated by necessity. They work because they must. They strive because they need to. They build because nothing exists yet. But what happens when you are born at the finish line? What happens when the struggle that gives any life's direction is removed before you even begin? For some people, the answer is freedom. For others, the answer is confusion. Barbara often seemed trapped between those two realities. She possessed freedom beyond imagination. Yet she frequently appeared uncertain about what would make her truly happy. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. Millions of people looked at Barbara Hutton's life and saw perfection. Barbara herself often looked at it and saw something missing. Perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate decades later. Because deep down, most people understand that happiness is not simply the accumulation of possessions. It is connection, purpose, belonging, trust. The things Barbara spent much of her life pursuing. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that she often searched for those things in places where they could never fully be found. In wealth, in status, in attention, in marriage. Yet, the moments that seemed to matter most were often the simplest. A grandfather who called her princess. A son who loved her unconditionally. Brief moments when she felt seen not as an heiress but as a human being. Maybe that is the lesson hidden beneath Barbara Hutton's extraordinary life. The world teaches us to envy people who have everything. Barbara's story asks whether everything is really what we think it is. Because the truth is that money can buy houses, but not home. It can buy company, but not loyalty. It can buy admiration, but not love. And it can buy comfort. But it cannot heal a wound that has been carried since childhood. For decades, Barbara searched for peace in places where peace could not be found. And by the end of her life, that search had become the defining story of who she was. Not the richest woman in America, not the Woolworth heiress, not the woman who married 7 times, but a person still searching for something she had lost long ago. Something no fortune, no title, and no amount of attention could ever replace. In the final years of her life, Barbara Hutton spent much of her time away from the glamorous world that had once seemed to revolve around her. The parties were gone. The headlines were quieter. Many of the people who had once crowded around her had disappeared. The extraordinary fortune remained. But much of the excitement surrounding it had faded. As Barbara grew older, her health declined. Years of emotional strain, physical illness, and personal loss had taken their toll. The woman who had once been photographed in royal jewels and designer gowns now lived a far more private existence, and eventually that long journey came to an end. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton died in Los Angeles at the age of 66. The newspapers reported her death. Biographers summarized her marriages. Historians calculated the fortune she inherited. Once again, the world focused on the money, but perhaps money was never the real story. Perhaps it never was. Because when we step back and look at Barbara Hutton's life as a whole, a different picture emerges. This is not simply the story of an heiress. It is not simply the story of 7 marriages. It is not even the story of one of the largest fortunes in American history. It is the story of a person searching for something that cannot be purchased. Think about everything Barbara possessed. She owned magnificent homes. She travelled the world. She met royalty. She wore jewels that most museums would be proud to display. She had access to a life that millions of people could only dream about. And yet, the moments that seemed to matter most had very little to do with any of those things. A grandfather who made her feel special. A son who loved her without conditions. A few brief relationships that gave her hope. Those were the memories that carried emotional weight. Not the diamonds, the headlines as not the bank accounts, because human beings are not built to survive on wealth alone. We are built for connection, for belonging, for trust, for the feeling that we matter to someone. Barbara spent much of her life searching for those things. Sometimes she searched in marriage. Sometimes she searched in social status. Sometimes she searched in attention and admiration. But none of those places provided lasting peace. Why? Because the thing she was looking for had been lost long before she became famous, long before she became wealthy, long before she became Barbara Hutton, the heiress. It was lost when she was a little girl who lost her mother, a little girl who watched important people disappear from her life, a little girl who never fully stopped wondering whether the people she loved would stay. In many ways, the rest of her life became a search for an answer to that fear. Each marriage was a possibility. Each new beginning was a possibility. Each relationship carried the hope that maybe this time the story would end differently. This time she would feel safe. Maybe this time she would feel secure. Maybe this time she would finally stop feeling alone. But life rarely gives us the chance to rewrite our earliest wounds so easily, and perhaps that is what makes Barbara Hutton's story so moving. Because beneath the fortune, the fame, and the glamour, her struggles were deeply human. Most people know what it feels like to lose someone. Most people know what it feels like to seek acceptance. Most people know what it feels like to hope that the next chapter will finally bring happiness. Barbara's circumstances were extraordinary. Her emotions were not. That is why her story continues to resonate decades after her death. Not because she was rich, but because she reminds us of a truth that many people spend their lives discovering. There are some things money can never buy. It cannot buy childhood security. It cannot buy genuine trust. It cannot buy unconditional love. And it cannot heal every wound left behind by losses. In the end, Barbara Hutton may have possessed almost everything the world had to offer. Yet the thing she wanted most was surprisingly simple. To feel loved, to feel safe, to know that someone would stay. Perhaps that is the great tragedy of her life. But perhaps it is also the lesson. Because if one of the richest women who ever lived could spend a lifetime searching for those things, then maybe they were the most valuable things in the world all along. And maybe Barbara Hutton's story was never really about wealth. Maybe it was about what every human being is searching for. A place to belong, a reason to feel loved, and the hope that, in the end, we will not have to face life alone.